Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Mariah Blake. I'm an investigative journalist and a current Nieman Fellow. And it is really an honor to be sharing the stage with these three very gifted and dogged reporters. On the stage with me are Cara Fitzpatrick and Michael LaForgia of the Tampa Bay Times. Michael, I'm glad you made it.
I'm glad to be here.
And Margie Mason of the Associated Press. I'm going to start with a question that I know everybody is wanting to hear the answer to. As mentioned earlier, Michael and Cara are married. And I understand that Margie and her teammate Robin McDowell are also very good friends. And so I would like both of you to talk about the challenges and upsides of working on an intense long-term project with someone you're so close to. Michael and Cara, can you go first, please?
I was really going to have her go first, but that's fine. I think the challenge for us was not just working together, but also sharing, a newborn and a 16-month-old. So sort of the juggling that goes into parenting, and we spent a lot of time basically trading back and forth the babies. Essentially, you pick up the babies, and then I'll go back to work, and taking the kids to the newspaper on the weekends. And our 3-year-old now says she doesn't say reporter, she says she's a porter. And asked us on Christmas Day this year, actually, if we were going to the newspaper because she spent that much time at the newspaper. So,
Yeah, the thing that, how's that? That's great. Okay, the thing that you've got to understand about Cara is that she's extraordinarily difficult to work with. But
I was waiting for that.
But we made it work, one way or the other. Really, I joke about that. Really, the most difficult part of doing this project with my wife was juggling the kids. Basically, we don't have a lot of family back home in Tampa, or the St. Petersburg areas where we live. We don't have parents or in-laws around, so we're our main source of childcare. Basically, they go to a daycare basically in the day and a preschool, but juggling the kids, having to, you always want to stay late, you always want to stay until 10 o'clock, finishing up that last bit of your project that you're working on, but you can't do it. One of us has to basically stop where we are and go pick up the kids, and that's what we did for 18 months. It was pretty taxing. But we sat across from one another in desks, which is a great idea if you ever work with your spouse on a high wire act investigative project. Do that. Do sit across from them. It didn't lead to much tension, I got to tell you, other than the picking up the kids.
Margie?
In my case, our team was unique in that we were a team of 4 reporters. And 4 female reporters. See, I don't even think of us as females. We're just reporters. But a lot of attention has been given to that fact that we're all females. And we had a female editor as well, Mary Raj Kumar. So we were all of the women were extremely close. And we still are. It's a sisterhood. It's a very tight-knit team. Robin and I started this project together initially, and she and I have worked, collaborated on many projects in the past. And actually, this whole story came to be because we were working on another story about Rohingya, the persecuted Muslim group from Myanmar. And so that's how this came to be. And we kind of joke that we share one brain. We really are so, and Todd in the back there who's filming knows us both very well. He can attest to the fact that we are basically one. She's a very tall. She's got the legs, but we share a brain, and it's so incredible when you can work with somebody and kind of have a kernel of an idea, one of us, and then the other person takes that and expands it into so much more, and then from there it just grows and grows and grows. And we were able to bring Esther Tucson is phenomenal Burmese Kachin, ethnic Kachin reporter, just dogged, and these were her people. And she was just determined to dig and get at this. A very young reporter. She's only been a reporter for 2 years. And of course, Martha Mendoza, many of you probably know her. She's just extraordinary. This is her second Pulitzer. And she and I had worked together in the past as well. And so for us to have this team of women and to just be so close, we were juggling crazy time zones. So our editor was in Miami in one time zone. Martha was in California in another. Robin and Esther were in Burma, which is another, and then I was in Jakarta. So I think it was like 14 hours time difference, which was the greatest. And we were on the phone almost every day and every night with each other.
And do you think the fact that you were all women had an impact on the reporting and editing dynamic at all?
You know, people have asked us if we think it was a negative, and I think, if anything, it was a positive. You know, we were dealing with men who had been tortured and abused. Many of them were very ashamed. And so when Esther came and started talking to these men, she was like their little sister. And they just opened up to her. And to us as well. They felt very comfortable talking to us. And so I think that in some ways, you know, we were very sympathetic to them. We were very soft with them. Not that a man could not have done this story just as well, but I think that in terms of them opening up to us, it helped.
Well, since we have an entire stage full of journalists, I thought I would have the other panelists ask each other one question. Margie, do you want to go first?
Okay. Having just been through this myself, I want to know what was harder, the reporting or the editing?
That's a great question. You know, both of them were extraordinarily difficult. I got to say that the editing was more painful for me than the reporting because, you know, when you're reporting, at least when we were reporting, we're out there talking to people, trying to find different sources. I mean, we did so much work for this series. The work that didn't even make it into the final product. I mean, just with the data, we did enough analysis of different databases to probably power 5 separate standalone investigative projects, and we synthesized that into one. That was challenging, but then it doesn't quite compare to the like soul-crushing editing process that we underwent. We rewrote the first part. I rewrote the first part 40 times probably, and it was a 7,000-word story. That sucked.
Well, so
But it came out.
This actually brings me to another question that I had hoped to ask both of you, because both of these pieces were very deeply reported, but neither of them were bogged down by. So the writing was quite light and lovely in both of them. And so I wanted to hear from you about the process. How, when you had that huge volume of information, did you manage to keep it from bogging down the story? And it sounds like in your case it was a lot of rewriting and editing.
Yeah, and a lot of reconceptualizing the story. I mean, I'm not sure if everyone has seen the beginning. We had it became an iconic sort of internet presentation that we started our project with. That was a direct result of us not being able to get the lead of part 1 correct, right? At one point, that was going to be the lead of part 1 because we couldn't figure out a way. You know, we knew that black kids were doing worse in Pinellas County than black kids anyplace else in Florida. And after surrounding ourselves with the data and really getting to know the players and seeing the decisions that were made, it was so galling and so compelling to us. But every time we wrote it down on a piece of paper, it stunk. There was no resonance, there was no emotional sort of response engendered by it. And it was driving us nuts, so we wanted to visualize it and thought, let's just start the story with this and then go right into the nut graft and the findings. So let's try that. And then when we started doing it, it was so good that we thought, well, now we need to break it off and make it its own thing. And we still don't know how to start the story.
So, Margie, I'd actually like to ask you the same question, and then we'll do the asking one another question. But, I mean, I was really struck by how lovely and light the prose in Seafood for Slaves, particularly the first installment in the series was. And I know that you spent 18 months on it, so I'm wondering what was the process that you went through, and what role did your editors play in making it so readable?
I mean, there were a lot of edits. I think, though, we obviously, being AP, there's no way we could ever do 7,000 words. I mean, that's a fantasy. Even the narrative that I did, I think I managed to get away with 3,500, and that was, I was singing over that. I think that the story obviously went through a lot of editing, and we did rewrite a lot. There was a lot of discussion about the structure, a lot of kind of work went into kind of forming the story before we started writing it, and we put a lot of thought into it. And then, as reporters and writers, again, with these crazy time zones, there were times when we wrote together. All three of us would get on the phone and we wrote together. I think that if you've ever tried to write with someone, that describes the relationship that we have, and how close we are and how our brains really are. We would just, okay, what can we do here? Where can we move this? No, that doesn't work. That's redundant. And I'm the meticulous one. I'm insane I'm very anal about, any kind of extra stuff. So all the extra stuff, no, we're taking that out, we're taking that out. This is redundant, we're taking that out. So there was a lot of that went on. But yeah, obviously we're AP, so we try to stay lean as well, which I think served us well in this case.
Makes sense. All right, Michael and Cara, do you have a question for Margie?
Do you have a question?
I actually did. It's probably
Go
not
ahead.
the same question you had, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the safety issues, that as reporters, how did you make sure that you were safe, and how much concern did you have around that when you're dealing with something so sensitive? But, you were talking about the men, but for yourselves.
Well, I think we thought more about the men than, obviously we didn't ignore our safety. We were very conscious and we talked a lot about it, but we were very concerned about the men. There was one incident in Bingham. Robin and Esther had been asked to leave. It was private property, and they had been asked to leave the company grounds. And so they left the company grounds, but they thought, well, the company doesn't own the water. So it was the night before they were scheduled to leave, and they decided to go out on a small wooden boat and kind of try to get some shots and footage of these boats, and maybe try to even yell some questions to the men. And one of the thugs from the company saw them going and kind of yelled, and then jumped on a speedboat and came racing within just a couple, meters of them. And they thought, I think Esther's quote was, she felt her soul escape from her body, because they thought that they were going in the water. And this was not a place where, it's not like there were police or no one knew they were there. They were really in the middle of nowhere. So that was scary. And then we had to really take precautions when we were in Samutsakan and Papua New Guinea. We didn't talk about that story, but, we there for a while were talking about going to Papua New Guinea. And we did a lot of research and came to the conclusion that it just wouldn't be safe, and so we didn't go.
So, given that newsroom budgets are shrinking, were these very time-intensive projects a hard sell with your editors? And did you feel an extra obligation to make the stories work, or to have a very major impact? Michael and Cara, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I was going to mention it's just as far as the cost goes, two things. I don't think that we ever felt any kind of reluctance on the part of editors, as far as paying for public records and those things. Sometimes newspapers are a little slow to get your checks out, so we were frequently floating checks out of our bank account, which was fun. But also Michael received a fellowship that paid for a certain amount of the cost, and that was hugely helpful, I think, to us. Do you want to answer the other part of that?
Yeah, so we got a grant basically from the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California, and it was excellent. They paid for some of a large portion of the public records. We spent more than $10,000 on public records alone.
Well, and I guess the more substantial cost from the editor's perspective is
Time and
obviously
energy,
your
absolutely.
time. So,
Yes, I
you know,
was just
3
about to-
reporters plus data people working on a story for a year is a very substantial investment. There's not a lot of reporters that get to do that kind of work these days.
No, there's no question. And, you know, we have a pretty unique setup. We're very lucky at the Tampa Bay Times. We have a full-time investigative team, and we do, you know, there are 2 reporters and some data people who get to work on longer-term projects. 6 months, a year would not be unusual for us. That sort of thing is not as available to the other people in our newsroom, so that was what we sort of had to convince them of when we brought them the idea.
How about you, Margie?
Well, we kind of worked quietly. Robin and I worked very quietly on the sidelines while we were doing our regular jobs for maybe 9 months to a year until we needed to then travel to the island. And I know when we pitched the story, it was expensive because it was difficult to get to. And when they were deciding whether or not to let us go, one of our editors said, you know, we're the AP. We have a moral obligation to do this. If this is happening, we don't know what we're going to find, but it, you know, we have a moral obligation to do this. And I think that was kind of really what we heard repeatedly. We were given really AP, especially once we found the island. At that point, they were incredibly supportive of whatever we needed. You know, everybody backed us. We still were doing stuff on the sides as well. You know, we didn't stop doing our day jobs, and there were some pretty big news stories that we actually had to cover, including plane crashes and migrant crises, and we also had the lead up to the Myanmar elections that they had to deal with.
So you were covering your beats while you were working on this story. For what portion of this project were you actually still covering your beat?
We were still doing stories when they popped up, mainly
Okay.
big stories.
Okay.
So, you know, like again, the lead up to the Burmese elections, when the Rohingya migrant crisis happened, we all jumped in on that. When the AirAsia plane crashed, you know, I went to Vietnam and did some stories there. So we were still doing things. But, you know, once we really got into it, and Martha put out a big project on airport perimeter security, which you probably saw. So, you know, we were juggling.
So Michael and Cara, your team interviewed a number of families with really sort of heartbreaking stories about how they'd been affected by the school system. I'm wondering how you got in contact with these families. It seems like the process for tracking down data is somewhat more self-explanatory than finding families, especially some such as the Otero family, which weren't even living in the district anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Lisa Gartner took the point on being out in the streets and tracking down families. It was a challenge, though. I mean, we all did it to some extent. She didn't do the entire thing, but I would say probably 60 to 70% of the families that appear in the story she went out and got just by being persistent, hanging out at. We visited churches. She went to Little League games, and she got turned away a lot, and we got turned away a lot. We went door to door in some places, right? But the reporting to find families sort of followed different tracks, right? There were people who we approached cold in the neighborhoods and barbershops, churches, Little League games, tutoring centers, that type of thing. And then there were cases like Ivan Otero that you mentioned. We very early in the process put out, and this is something that I do for all my projects, basically, a request for lists of all the police calls to the addresses that we were going to be focusing on. In this case, we had 5 schools. We requested all of the police reports that were attached to the case numbers that were showed up in those police reports. And as parts of those, they identified, children who had been victims of violence, parents, family members, teachers who had been assaulted by kids. And we used that as sort of a roadmap to track down sources, and that's how we found Ivan.
Okay. Can you briefly tell the audience Ivan's story?
Yeah, sure. So Ivan Otero, he was the older of 2 boys who were born to this family who didn't have a ton of money. They were from Kissimmee, which is outside Orlando in Central Florida. the mother, this is actually, there were 3 kids at one point, a middle daughter. Their mother was driving their minivan one day, and it rolled over and crashed off the highway and sank in a canal, a retention pond. And the little girl died. Ivan had to be brought back. He was the eldest. And his youngest brother, Derek, almost didn't make it. He suffered brain damage, was in a coma for a very long time, and required pretty intensive therapies multiple times a week in order to basically stay at home with his family. As part of that, they moved down to Pinellas County, and they wanted to be as close to All Children's Hospital, the children's hospital in our city, as they could. So they got an apartment that was within walking distance of it. It turned out that that apartment was zoned for one of the 15 worst schools in Florida, Campbell Park Elementary, and also one of the more violent of the schools that we looked at. So shortly thereafter, Ivan was enrolled there. Derek was getting his regular treatments, but Ivan started getting bullied by the other boys. And at one point, he was beaten up so badly in the cafeteria by another student that the police were called. And basically, from that point on, Ivan's mom was having nightmares about her sending her kid to school every day. She would wake up in the middle of the night after having dreamed that someone was going to stab her son, for example. And after enduring this for a period of weeks, she basically looked at her husband and said, we've got to make a decision here. Either we stay where Derek can get his treatments, or we pull Ivan out and keep him safe. It was like a Sophie's choice that this family had to make because the school was so violent. And at the end of the day, they opted to take the kid out of school, move north to a different neighborhood, still in the school district, but much farther north, away from the violence and the low-performing 5 schools that were in South St. Pete. And it meant that the younger of the 2 kids couldn't get regular treatments anymore. So that was the choice she had to make.
Margie, you and your team persuaded just a surprising mix of people to speak to you. So in addition to actually contacting slaves, you persuaded a worker at this company that was using slaves to sneak in a camera. You also got a slave broker to tell you about the tactics that agents were using, the brutal tactics that agents were using to recruit slaves, including drugging and kidnapping migrants. You got a member of Thai parliament to actually admit that he was accepting bribes. Can you talk about how you went about persuading all or at least some of these people to speak to you and to reveal things to you that didn't necessarily serve them to reveal?
I think in the case of the men that were on Bengina, they were so desperate that they wanted to tell their stories. I mean, there was no holding back. And I don't think that they realized how dangerous it was, or maybe they just didn't care. They just wanted to tell someone. And Esther was there, and she could speak their language, and it was like the first kind of, person who would actually come in and ask them, what's happened to you? And so they wanted the world to know, they wanted us to know, they wanted everybody to know. So for the guys, it was no problem. Some of the other people, I think that this has just been going on for so long, and it's kind of an accepted way that this operation, the seafood operation, works, that people just talked openly about the situation. And there was really, I don't think, anything special that we did. We called people up. We had a Thai reporter who worked with us, and she called some people up. And, the guy who talked about the bribery, it was just, this is how it's done. You've got to bribe people to, make this happen. So, I think that was a large part of it, is that this was not, again, it was an open secret. And no one seemed to care much about it until we came along.
Do you think it's different reporting in Southeast Asia in that respect? Do you think if you're reporting on something similar in the United States, you would encounter that kind of openness?
Maybe. Okay. Yeah, I think probably so. People here tend to be a bit more guarded when they're talking to reporters, right? So, I mean, I think that probably played a big part, And again, I think the biggest part is that it's just the way things work.
Yeah.
They were just explaining to us how things work.
Interesting. Michael and Cara, your series relied very heavily on data. I'm wondering how you went about collecting and analyzing that huge volume of data and how instrumental the data was in shaping your approach to the rest of the reporting.
Sure. I think, as education reporters, Lisa and I spend a lot of time sort of living in data. That's kind of something that you do a lot just as part of the job, always looking at test scores and things of that nature. For this, this was certainly a bigger effort as far as getting just the amount of data. At one point we got a database of how many times substitute teachers were used in the entire school district. And it was, classroom by classroom. That's a little bit more than we might usually get. And that ended up being actually a relatively small part of one of the stories. We looked at, teacher certification scores. That was, millions of rows of data that our data team had to work with. So that was, it was almost like things I blocked now because some of it was just the budget information that we collected, making spreadsheets out of trying to unravel whether or not these schools were getting, equal funding. That alone was a massive effort, of getting data in the story. I think, one of the things about it is that it drove a lot of the reporting and gave us a lot of leads to chase after and things to look at. But I think part of the, maybe power of the series is that none of them really read like especially data-heavy stories, and I think part of that is because we had such incredible examples of families and children and things that sort of made these data points seem more real than they might have if it was just a, straight data story.
If I could jump in, I mean So I think the data was foundational in terms of driving which stories we told, but we didn't. The thing I think that set our story apart from some other stories that rely a lot on data is that we were skeptical in dealing with the data and wanted to vet it by also interviewing the people in the community. And so we were sort of we were forming hypotheses based on discipline data and teacher quality data and enrollment into special programs like magnets and fundamental schools, that type of data. But we also went into the community and said, hey, we're seeing evidence of this in these numbers here. What do you think? I mean, is this what it's like for you and your family? And so that made a difference, I think.
All right. I think I'm going to open it up to questions now.
Not all at once.
Anne Marie.
I'll start. So I'm wondering for each team, on projects that last this long, there are always sort of, there are moments of crisis within the, about the reporting or about the story, where something you thought you had, you realize you don't have, or a crisis of confidence about the power of the story. Something, and I'm just wondering if each of you could talk about maybe a moment like that and how you overcame that.
I don't think that there was one particular moment of crisis for us. I mean, it was like every day there was a new crisis. I think for us, really, the hardest part was trying to piece everything together initially, and then even once we kind of started really digging into this, because we didn't have, unlike in their case, they had all this amazing data. We didn't have data, and we didn't have a source. So all we had was just ourselves and these, we were clawing at different, documents and things we could get our hands on, but a lot of it was fabricated. We found all these shell companies, we found all these fake documents, we found, generations of this stuff that had been set up to allow this kind of sham industry to flourish. And so oftentimes we would get these little nuggets and it wouldn't make sense. And we would just rack our brains and it would be so frustrating because we knew that it must mean something, but what is it and what does it mean? And then we'd put it aside and then maybe a month would pass and we'd then get a new nugget that would then fit with that old nugget and the light bulb would come on and we'd say, oh, remember that thing we put aside? Yeah, well, that makes sense now. So it was like just doing this jigsaw puzzle and constantly, putting things in the wrong place and trying to kind of figure out what fits where and not having, again, any documents to turn to see, hey, does this making sense? Or any source to go to who had been there before.
I was kind of thinking about what Michael already talked about a little bit, with the chart and the decision about sort of how to frame and lead day one. I think part of that struggle for us was that, when you have spent the amount of time that was spent on this and you're dealing with such an important issue, you really don't want that first story or the first couple of things you put out to, fall completely flat. And I think, there was probably a little bit of pressure on us in that regard, and certainly Michael, who was rewriting it, 30 and 40 times. And I think you remind me on this, but I think at one point our editor was actually talking about maybe spiking the chart or wasn't as into the idea of the chart. And then, it was this sort of viral sensation, so.
Yeah. I'm trying to pick a good crisis, the most interesting crisis for you. That was bad. I mean, rewriting it, but that wasn't really a crisis as much as it was just, wanting to make me admit myself into some type of rehab and disappear for a long time. We had, disregard that. So we had a moment. We published our first story on a Thursday? Mm-hmm. Is that what we did?
Friday. On
a Friday. So we had presented the school district with our findings that week, that Monday, I think. And they had gotten back to us. They wrote a memo and they said, okay, basically they copped to everything except for one thing, which was the funding part of it, which is a pretty explosive part that we dealt with. They said, oh, no. You're completely ignoring this other key pile of money that we heretofore have told you nothing at all about.
That's right.
And this is a big deal if you're going to say that, if you're going to basically allege that a major Florida school board is underfunding majority black schools that have gone to pot since they voted to resegregate. So we sat there, we had spreadsheets, all of us, Nathaniel, Lisa, Cara, I was there. Thank God Cara's parents were in town, and they were able to stay with our kids until midnight while we sort of hashed this out. Our editor was there, Chris Davis, and we were banging our heads against this thing, doing our own analysis. Finally, we printed out, they sent us some financial documents as proof that we were wrong. And so we were like at a complete loss. We printed these documents out, looked at them, and in the documents themselves, if you lined them up in the correct way and reshuffled them and looked at them the way that they were supposed to be put together in the first place, it proved the inequalities on its face. So we underlined those real quick and then swapped out the parts of the story that relied on different information, put that in there, and that was that put that fire out on the short term.
Since the stories were published, have you heard a lot of information from other people? In the old days of payphones, we called it people dropping dimes, but have lots of other people gotten back to you and said, hey, this is happening in my industry or my other part of the fishing industry elsewhere in the world or other school districts throughout Florida? Or is the story going to grow in either case in a big way?
Yeah. We're still going. Stay tuned.
We had a tremendous outpouring from teachers, from family members, and it's been sort of building on itself. You went and talked to a teacher the other day, right?
Yeah, well, so I was gonna say we didn't talk about this a great deal yet, but But there was a pretty massive outpouring from the community, but the district has also been facing a lot of pressure because there is a civil rights investigation now from the federal DOE. There's a Title I investigation that's being run by our state DOE, which is Department of Education, I'm sorry. And then there's 2 potential court actions happening now. One is the reopening of a 50-year-old federal desegregation lawsuit, which is a pretty huge deal. So, there's a lot of pressure externally now on the district to make changes. I will say, too, that because I'm, back on the beat and covering a lot of this follow-up and fallout from the series, I've also started getting, again, phone calls from families and from teachers who said that either they had been approached, 6-8 months ago by reporters and were too scared to talk and now feel, comfortable talking, or Dirk Shad, the photographer, and I met with a woman and her 2 children last week, and she basically said that that she thinks that they're an example of some of the discipline disparities, and she's also a teacher in the school district and had saved for me all of the documentation, the kids' referrals, and all these things that seem to show a pattern of retaliation, and that's just one more family coming forward, and we've been getting a lot of those phone calls. So.
Dealing with all the time zones that you had to deal with, now that it's, 3 years later, have things become easier? Maybe Skype, even email?
Well, no, it's a little bit, actually, for me, it's a little bit harder now because Robin in December moved to Minnesota. And so now I have to deal with one more time zone, actually. So I don't really know if it's easier in that regard or not. But we do a lot of email. And one of the things that was actually quite beneficial about the time zones is that we almost had like a 24-hour operation. So, Robin and I would work it during the day, our time, and then we would kind of hand the baton off to Martha, and we would say, okay, it's your day, you chase this. And of course, she was on the same time zone as the editor, so she had to deal with all of the editing questions that came in while we were sleeping as well. So, and then she would finish her time, and we'd talk, and she'd say, okay, well, I made progress with this and this and this, but I still need this and this and this. You guys take it. So this is we just kept it going almost 24 hours.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Thompson from Shorenstein. I think I've tried to hire at least a couple of you. I'm curious, I know you're doing a lot of career counseling at this point. I saw that you're on the program of IRE coming up in June. And I'm wondering what kind of advice you're giving to young journalists who want to do this kind of work and feel like they can't find a receptive home for it, can't find the right editor, papers that don't want to spend the money, all the barriers that are out there. What are you telling them?
I've got a great answer for this. I'm going to let them go first.
I think in my case, I often get approached by young reporters who are interested in being overseas. And I've been overseas for a really long time, and so has Robin. And, the advice that I always give people is just do it. I mean, that's what I did. You just go and do it. Don't wait for somebody to give you a job or give you an offer. Just go and figure it out. And this type of reporting, obviously, it does take a lot of time and a lot of money. But if you start drilling into something and you get something, you're going to be able to sell it. If you go to somebody and say, hey, I found a bunch of guys in a cage on an island, I don't know who's going to pass that story up, right? So I just always tell people to not be scared, especially in this climate. You cannot wait to get hired on, even at, wire service, which is, how a lot of us ended up overseas initially.
I like when people ask me this, when people come up and ask, how do you get to be an investigative reporter right out of college and whatnot, I tell them that I think the trick is that you've always got to be working on the best story at the paper that you can put in the paper, that you can accomplish, right? It doesn't work if you're going to sit down as a 22-year-old out of college and say, hey, I'm going to go prove that this school district in Florida systematically, resegregated and then neglected for a decade these 5 schools. So it's a process, and you're not going to get the time to do that kind of thing off the bat either, until you start showing the bosses that if you just give me a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity, you're going to look good as a result of it, right? And it starts off as these little weekenders or even dailies that set you apart. But then you've got to keep building on it, and you should always be working on the most important story at the paper that you can accomplish, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, when Lisa and I were at this education conference for a few days, and there was a lot of talk, as there tends to be when journalists are together, about cuts and not having enough space in the paper and all these things. And so we had quite a few questions about some of that and the process. And it doesn't, my advice doesn't really lend itself to having a really healthy work-life balance. But I was telling some of these younger reporters, that if what you want to do is some of this really tough work that takes all of this time and effort, it's not very easy to go to an editor and say, I want 18 months to work on something. That's just never going to happen, But kind of, what she was talking about with, carving out time and working on things while you're working on your beat. What we didn't mention, Michael works on long-term projects as his job, but Lisa and I, for the first however many months of the project, we traded off covering the beat every 3 weeks, which had its own challenges, to be covering the beat for 3 weeks and then hand it off to her and then, doing all of that. And we also, we worked nights and we worked weekends and we cared enough to do that. So I think, if you find the right story, like kind of Michael was talking about, then, report the hell out of it and don't worry about getting home at 5 and having a nice Saturday at the beach, And the nice thing about that is that, now Lisa and I have kind of gone back to being beat reporters, but I feel like the expectation is a little different now. We have a little bit more room to tell an editor this is worth some time, and they'll take that more seriously now than maybe they would have however many, months and years ago.
I'm going to take one more question, Monica.
So I'm Monica Guzman, I'm a Nieman Fellow. Thank you guys for coming. The movie Spotlight, which maybe you've seen, one of my favorite aspects of it was when they got into the moral outrage that the reporters started to feel and the moral urgency that they felt because, they're going to sleep at night and who knows who's abusing who tonight. And I can only imagine, you're thinking there's men that could be beaten up right now. There's students who are getting this damage done to their childhoods, their entire lives right now. And yet, I have to make sure that this is worded perfectly, that this is written exactly. The emotional labor of that, I can't fathom. Can you talk a little bit about how you lived with that, as long as you had to make sure that these stories were what they needed to be to make the difference that had to be made?
I think in our case, we were truly reporting from the heart on this story. I mean, it mattered to us on such an emotional level. We cared about these men, and we needed to get it right. The story, we couldn't just tell that there were men on the island. We had to show where the fish was going, and that took time, and we knew those guys were there. I think the thing that kind of kept us from, really getting too upset about it is that the government of Indonesia, a new government had come in with a very dynamic new fishing minister. And we knew, just from working with her, that when she found out that this was happening, she was going to handle it. And she did, within a week and a half, which is, that's extraordinary. It was the rescue that they did wasn't even planned. It was totally spontaneous. So I think that was the thing that kind of kept us from getting too upset about it. I can tell you that we dreamed it. We were we were going to sleep and dreaming about the men. We were dreaming about, the reporting. It was all consuming. I went underground for a year. Basically, some of my friends thought I had left the country because they didn't see me. And we worked, as she said, it was weekends. There were days when we were working 18 hours a day for a month straight with no days off. And we just did it. We just powered through it. We had to.
So I'm gonna sound like a jerk. You gotta. So my personal opinion is, if you're in a situation and you start to feel this moral outrage, and trust me, with the stuff that we were seeing, it was there. We were feeling it. We were pissed off at the situation. But you got to be skeptical of that, and you've got to sort of distance yourself from it as a reporter, because otherwise you can start putting stuff into a story that is not going to nail the point that you want to make. And if you let yourself sort of be blinded by that, you're sunk. As an investigative reporter whose job it is to nail the story, not to sort of pour our hearts out into the thing, we've got to be sure that even the most skeptical and dispassionate observer is going to feel the same way that we do at the end of the day. My boss, Chris Davis, is like the best at this. He is absolutely merciless when it comes to poking holes in even what you feel, powered by some of this moral outrage, is a completely airtight case. He can deflate it in a second. And that's exactly what you need. It's how, it's how you win in a story like this.
I would say, well, two things, but he's absolutely right about Chris, but that's also, it's really hard sometimes, when you do feel like you've spent a bunch of time. There were things that we thought we were going to write about that we ended up not writing about. There was time that we spent, and you get sort of attached as the reporter who just spent 3 weeks trying to nail something, to have Chris or Michael or whomever say, like, no, that's not it. That is a hard thing to do. I think as far as, some of the stories that we were told by families, and, Lisa especially, but some of us spent quite a bit of time with some of these families. I spent a long time with a family that had dealt with homelessness and a lot of issues with this, this mother that had 6 kids and was in and out of a shelter, was homeless, but still had a book of behavior expectations. That's a woman who's trying really hard when she's carrying around a book of behavior expectations, like a sticker chart for her kids when she's homeless, and just trying to feed them. But for me, I think that sort of thing makes it easier then to go and confront school board members and district officials, and especially as a beat reporter, people that I deal with on a pretty regular basis. That sort of sense of anger or moral outrage makes it much easier to go to those people and demand an explanation than maybe it would be if you didn't feel some of those things, if it was just data or just an academic argument. So I think for me that was something that was sort of a driving force in some ways.
So inspirational to hear you all. Thank you so much. Please
you.
join me one more time in congratulating them, and also thanking the Bingham and Taylor families for their support for this story.